Mother and daughter were sitting in the kitchen and talking. The mother was displeased. No, she was almost in despair. Vera, so you've really decided to go? Yes, Mom, I want to meet up with the girls, and just in general. You do realize he might be there. Sergey, I mean. I understand, Mom. The mother grabbed a towel and began furiously wiping the dishes, rearranging cups, and clattering cutlery. Vera felt awkward, but she was certain about her decision. She would attend this reunion. 5 years had passed. Yes, her heart still traitorously leaped at the thought of him. Her soul sank. But she had long understood with her head. Sergey was a thing of the past. The boy who shattered her heart into tiny pieces remained there. In childhood memories. And it was time to move on. To do that, she had to dispel all the ghosts of the past. Clean out the closets of skeletons and look her main fear in the eyes. And ask directly, was it worth it? Vera's mother didn't think so. She remembered how 4 years ago, her daughter had become only a shadow of herself. How slowly all the childlike joy left her. The hope for something better. How she suffered. The mother remembered all of it. And she knew for sure that there were no ghosts of the past. There was a person who had caused her daughter indescribable pain. And Vera wants to go to a meeting where he will be. Where her heart, so carefully and painstakingly put back together by her mother, will be broken again. The mother knew all this. Knew, but could not influence it. Vera and Sergey met in 5th grade. He was the new kid. A small, tousled sparrow. In a jacket from his older brother. And pants. Shiny from constant and improper ironing. He came from a troubled family. That's what they said back then. No one even knew his father's name. He disappeared without a trace. So, Sergey had his grandfather's patronymic. His mother was there. Trying to stay young, beautiful. She believed she had her whole life ahead of her. And her son was left in the past. Along with the daughter. Fortunately, the daughter was grown and quite independent. She took care of Sergey's upbringing in her spare time. Sergey was difficult. But can a child growing up in such circumstances be easy? A child who was really needed by no one. Vera, of course, knew nothing of this. She couldn't even guess. How could she? The only daughter who received all the love, tenderness, care from her parents. Without remainder. Vera was smart, strong, and very beautiful. Sergey, in turn, was clever and a cunning troublemaker. Not handsome, but incredibly charming. He had a backbone. Even as a little boy, it seemed he already knew what's what. What this life is worth. They became friends. How? When he first walked into the class and glanced over all the desks, Vera didn't know why, but she nodded to him and pointed to the seat next to hers. He smiled and walked over to her. And so it all began. It was a very strange friendship, one that puzzled teachers. But they hoped it was for the best, that Vera could tame the destructive force of the troublemaker. And she really could. They spent all their free time together. Talking, doing homework, walking together. Girls always hovered around Sergey. He wasn't a heartthrob, but there was definitely something about him. Now it's called charisma. Back then? Then he just knew how to smile in a way that made you feel warm inside. And he was strong and fearless. He wasn't afraid to get into scrapes. Often walked around with bruised fists and black eyes. He was respected, his opinion mattered. Small and unimpressive, but he quickly became the leader of the class parallel. He also easily broke girls' hearts as easily as the knuckles of his fists. And only with Vera did he maintain a long friendship. It should be said, Vera was also a star. Just of a different sky. Smart, beautiful, decisive. The hope of teachers and the darling of the masses. She was the center of attention. And always surrounded by suitors. But she was only interested in her studies. Until a certain time. They grew up. Changed. Their relationship to each other changed. It's unknown who fell in love first. Sergei always said there was no one better than her. And Vera laughed. At first, so childishly. Then embarrassedly. And then she also looked at him with different eyes. And was lost. It was a strange couple. They spent every day together. But kept their distance from each other. Understanding that they were different. That each had their own path. Sergei's was to the army. Dara got into a prestigious university. Sergei was a street kid. She was the pride of the school. What future could these kids have? Once, it so happened that they were left alone in the classroom. After school. He was mopping the floors. She was wiping the blackboard. They joked, laughed. And then they quieted down. He looked into her eyes. And she looked into his heart. And nodded. Just like on the first day they met. The mop was thrown aside. The rag hung limply on the desk. And they stood, pressed closely to each other. And kissed. That's how it all started. Their school romance lasted 2.5 years. They continued to be an odd couple. He fought with boys after school. She hurried to do homework. In the evenings, he disappeared at gatherings where important male issues were discussed. She accompanied him. And felt the foolishness of these meetings. The boys stood around. Smoked. Sometimes drank and discussed some problems. Which weren't really problems. But it was done with such pomp and importance that sometimes she wanted to laugh. She was an outsider in his companies. He was an outsider in hers. And yet, they loved each other. With that childlike, devoted love. Dara melted in his hands. His embrace burned her skin and touched her soul. He protected her. He was gentle. He was sensitive. He, who broke the hearts of dozens of girls. Who had tried everyone he wanted. He, the street kid. Protected her. And she valued it. It was important. And tender. Once, Dara came home and encountered her mother's stern look. She said they urgently needed to talk. Dara's heart stopped because her mother's voice was trembling. Your teacher called me. She said you and Sergei are kissing during breaks. Dara shriveled up and blushed. Was silent. She had nothing to say. Daughter, I accepted your strange friendship. I never said anything to you. But now I am worried. I know Sergei is your friend. But you're so young. I'm afraid he will hurt you. That you will suffer. Mom, he will never hurt me. We love each other. Her mother just sighed. Love at 16 is a dangerous elixir, which in inexperienced hands can become poison. She didn't want her daughter to fall victim to these feelings. But what could she do? Forbid? Pull her away from her friend? No. It wasn't in her power. She could only talk and pray that her daughter would be wise. They had been dating for over a year, but their feelings were platonic. Dara knew for sure that Sergei had adult experiences with girls. There was an entire club of his exes at their school. The girls looked at Vera with hatred and waited for when she would join their ranks. But time passed. Nothing changed. One day, they had a difficult conversation. She directly asked why they only held hands and kissed. And he honestly answered that he didn't want to ruin her life. Dara was so astonished she nearly sat down. What did he mean by ruining? And that means spoiling. You have your whole life ahead of you. You understand that I'm from the wrong side of the tracks. You'll go to university, and I'll go to the army. You will be a golden girl. And me, I won't be able to give you anything. At least, not now. So, I don't want to take anything valuable from you. Something you might regret someday. And then she looked at him attentively and answered. What if I want this myself? Don't want to take? I'll give it to you myself. Don't you dare reject me. I'm responsible for myself. He just nodded. And couldn't reject her. Because he loved her madly. Their relationship became even closer. They were an odd couple, yes. But they loved each other. With a childlike, yet so strong and pure love. After school, she got into university on a scholarship. He went to the army. They decided that Vera would wait for him. And then they would get married. Rent an apartment. Vera's mother looked at this relationship with sorrow. But she couldn't do anything. Had no right. Sergei left. Vera stayed. They wrote letters to each other. Sergei ended up in a remote northern town, where visiting without a pass was impossible. Calls were rare. They exchanged letters. In one of them, he wrote that he met someone else. That he had thought long and hard about their relationship. And came to the conclusion that they had no future. That he would stay to serve in the north. But he really didn't want her to throw her life away for him. Because he had nothing to offer her. Except for bright feelings that would dissolve in the daily grind within a couple of years. He asked her not to call anymore. Not to write. Not to disturb. Forget. She couldn't comply with that. She called, wrote, tried to talk to him. And then he confessed that he was getting married soon. And that was the end of their childhood love. He was very sorry, he said. Vera hung up the phone and heard the pounding of her heart inside. Then it shattered into thousands of fragments. Her mother thought her daughter would go crazy. In the first weeks, she just lay there, her face buried in the wall. Sometimes muttering something to herself. She cried often and hardly ate anything. Then slowly she began to come to her senses. If that could be called so. She returned to her studies. Went for walks with her friends. But the sparkle in her eyes vanished. Her smile wasn't as bright. She seemed to have faded, aged, died. She really felt that she had become nothing but a shell. An empty shell into which she stuffed food day after day. Knowledge. Something else. Something else. And still, it was empty there. Emptiness inside. It had been almost 5 years since she parted ways with Sergei. The wounds had healed. Life had found its rhythm. Vera had suitors, admirers. But she wasn't going to get married. Didn't want to. Her mother worried a lot. But what could she do? Only warm her with words and hugs. And pray that her daughter would be prudent. Vera approached the graduates in a pensive mood. She wasn't sure if Sergei would be there. She hadn't seen him in 5 years. But she really wanted to see him. Look into his eyes and ask, was it worth it? She entered the classroom. Greeted the teacher. With the girls, many of whom she hardly recognized. Someone had a pregnant belly. Someone even came with children. Sergei was absent. The teacher hadn't changed much. Still lively and strict. She seated them and suggested they tell about themselves. When the classroom door swung open, Sergei stood in the doorway. Handsome. Grown up. Matured. In uniform. With epaulettes and even medals. Medals. He looked around and met her gaze. Stumbled upon it so that her heart jumped to her ears. He looked at her. She nodded. He smiled and walked towards Vera. The meeting ended. And Vera got ready to go home. She didn't plan to go to the restaurant. She just needed to know that he was okay. That he was alive. Happy. Happy that everything was fine. She made sure of it and therefore was getting ready to go home. Sergei grabbed her hand. Asked her to stay. She shook her head and walked away. Then he followed her. Sergei walked alongside and spoke. Spoke. About how much he missed her. About how he loves her. About how he deceived her and had no one else. He showed her the medals and explained that he had decided to go on a dangerous assignment for several years. That his task was to do everything to become someone. To earn more money. To provide her with the life she deserves. He walked and talked. Talked. And Vera remained silent. Walked. Tears rolled down her cheeks, washing away the makeup. And then she stopped and looked into his eyes. Inside, everything hurt from the offense. It burned. 5 years have passed, she said. 5 years. All this time you didn't care about me. Didn't cherish me. You roasted me on a skillet. Because you thought I needed something from you. I couldn't care less about what you were doing for 5 years without me. You betrayed our love. Yes, you became someone. Well done. I'm proud of you. You became someone. And over these 5 years, I stopped being someone. An empty shell. Every day I asked myself, what is this for? Why are you doing this to me? But I love you. I imagined 1,000 times how I would come back. How I would give you everything I could. And if I had gotten married and had children? I didn't care. I would still do everything to have you by my side. She wiped the tears from her cheeks. Bitter, resentful tears. And looked into his eyes. Sergei, was it worth it? These 5 years without me. Were they worth it? He was silent. His fabricated world crumbled before his eyes. His goal seemed so foolish. His act barbaric. He looked at her and hated himself. He covered his face with his hands and whispered, forgive me. Forgive me. Before her stood an unfit man in uniform. And a little boy. Disheveled. In his brother's jacket. And trousers polished to a shine. Troubled, they said about him. Vera wiped away her tears and looked at this fool. Stately. In uniform with medals. He whispered again. Forgive me. I'm an idiot. Yes, you are an idiot, she concluded. And what am I supposed to do now? He stirred, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a box. A mandatory red one. Absolutely velvet. Like in the movies. Heart-shaped. He deliberately chose it like this. Vera snorted. Exactly. Tut-tut. Wait, I'll get it now. He opened the box. Inside was a ring. With a diamond. Especially for you. He said it with such pride. I'm telling you, you're completely tut-tut. Vera, forgive me. Vera sighed. 5 years of life flashed before her eyes. An empty, lonely life with a broken heart. She looked at Sergei and his diamond ring. At the medals. She understood that this fool had done it for her. Tortured and killed her every day for 5 years for love. For her. And what to do with him now? She looked into his deep eyes and nodded. All right. Let's go have some tea. And then we'll see what to do next. He nodded in response and smiled. And followed her in the hope that she would forgive him after all. After all. After all.